The air was still. The leaves of the ancient oaks in Willow Park barely whispered. The sun, a fiery orb sinking below the horizon, cast long shadows that stretched and danced across the well-worn path. Jacob, lost in thought, ambled along, enjoying the familiar serenity of his evening walk. His faithful Labrador, Max, usually a bounding ball of energy, trotted quietly by his side. The park, usually bustling with activity, was eerily quiet this evening. The silence was a comforting blanket, muffling the noise of the city just beyond the park's borders. Jacob inhaled deeply, the sweet scent of freshly cut grass filling his lungs. He loved this park. It was his sanctuary, a place to escape the pressures of work and the anxieties that gnawed at him. The rhythmic crunch of their footsteps on the gravel path was the only sound that dared break the silence. As they rounded a bend, the last rays of sunlight filtering through the dense canopy above, Jacob felt a prickle of unease. The air seemed to grow heavy, the silence now pressing in on him like a physical weight. He glanced down at Max, searching for reassurance in the dog's familiar brown eyes. But Max, usually eager to chase squirrels or greet fellow canine companions, was strangely subdued. His ears were pricked, his body rigid, a low growl rumbling deep in his chest. Jacob stopped, his hand instinctively reaching out to reassure his companion. "What is it, boy?" he whispered, his voice tight with sudden apprehension. Max whined, his dark eyes fixed on something just beyond Jacob's line of sight. Jacob's heart pounded in his chest. He knew his dog. Max wasn't easily fazed. Something was wrong. He could feel it now, a shift in the atmosphere, a palpable tension that sent chills crawling down his spine. He strained to hear anything out of the ordinary, but the silence held, broken only by Max's soft growls. The hairs on the back of Jacob's neck stood on end. He tightened his grip on Max's leash, a knot of dread forming in his stomach. "Easy, boy, easy," Jacob murmured, more to himself than to Max. He tried to rationalize his fear. It was probably just a stray cat or maybe a raccoon rustling in the undergrowth, but deep down, a primal instinct screamed at him to run. Max's growls intensified, his body trembling with a mixture of fear and aggression. He lunged against the leash, teeth bared, a low, guttural snarl ripping from his throat. Jacob dug his heels into the gravel path, struggling to maintain his grip on the increasingly agitated dog. "Max, quiet!" he hissed, his voice sharp with urgency. He couldn't understand what had gotten into his normally placid companion. It was as if Max sensed something sinister, something hidden from human perception. The silence stretched, taut and heavy with unspoken menace. Jacob's gaze darted from side to side, searching the deepening shadows for the source of Max's distress. He saw nothing, but the feeling of being watched intensified, a cold finger tracing a line down his spine. Then he heard it, a soft, rhythmic thudding, like footsteps approaching on the path behind them. The sound was muffled, almost imperceptible at first, but it grew steadily louder, closer. Jacob's breath caught in his throat. He glanced over his shoulder, but the path behind them was shrouded in shadow, the darkness impenetrable. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through his apprehension, sending a jolt of adrenaline through his veins. He tightened his grip on Max's leash and quickened his pace, his heart hammering against his ribs. The footsteps quickened, matching their pace. Jacob risked another glance back. He still couldn't see anyone, but the sound of approaching footsteps was unmistakable now. Whoever was behind them was deliberately staying hidden in the shadows. Panic swelled in Jacob's chest, threatening to overwhelm him. He broke into a run, pulling Max along with him. The quiet evening walk had transformed into a desperate flight for safety. The gravel path blurred beneath his feet as Jacob ran, his lungs burning, his legs screaming for respite. But he didn't dare slow down, not with the sound of those relentless footsteps pounding behind him. He could hear Max panting beside him, the dog's breath ragged but his pace unwavering. They rounded a bend in the path, the trees thinning slightly, allowing a sliver of moonlight to penetrate the oppressive darkness. It was then that Jacob saw them. Two figures shrouded in dark hoodies emerged from the shadows ahead. They were tall and broad-shouldered, their faces obscured by the low-hanging hoods. Their movements were fluid and predatory, like wolves stalking their prey. Jacob's blood ran cold. They had been herded, driven towards this spot by someone or something lurking in the shadows. He skidded to a halt, his mind racing. There was no escape, nowhere to run. The figures advanced, their footsteps slow and deliberate, savouring his terror. Max snarled, baring his teeth, a low growl rumbling in his chest. But even Max's usual ferocity seemed muted, dwarfed by the palpable menace emanating from the figures before them. "Who are you?" Jacob's voice trembled, barely a whisper. The words hung in the air, unanswered. One of the figures chuckled, a low, guttural sound that sent chills down Jacob's spine. It was a sound devoid of humour, filled only with malice and something colder, something that spoke of a darkness that ran deeper than Jacob could comprehend. He felt a surge of primal fear, a deep-seated instinct that screamed at him to fight, to flee, to do anything but stand there like a deer caught in headlights. He fumbled in his pocket for his phone, his fingers clumsy with fear. He had to call for help. He had to get out of there. Section 4. A sudden assault. As Jacob's fingers closed around his phone, one of the figures lunged. It happened with a speed that defied logic, a blur of motion that caught him completely off guard. He felt a sharp pain in his side and cried out, the phone tumbling from his grasp and clattering uselessly on the asphalt path. Max, reacting instinctively, launched himself at the attacker, teeth bared, snarling ferociously. Jacob staggered back, clutching at his side. His fingers came away wet, sticky with blood. He had been stabbed. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. Panic surged through him, drowning out all rational thought. He stumbled, his legs threatening to give way beneath him. He could see Max grappling with one of the figures, the sounds of their struggle echoing in the night. But the other figure was advancing on him, a glint of metal flashing in the moonlight. A knife. He could see it now, a wickedly curved blade held loosely in the figure's hand. Terror lent him a burst of adrenaline. He dodged clumsily as the figure lunged again, the blade whistling past his ear. He heard Max cry out, a sharp yelp of pain, and his blood ran cold. They were going to kill him. He knew it with a certainty that transcended fear. He lashed out blindly, his fist connecting with something solid. He heard a grunt of pain, but the figure didn't falter. They were toying with him, enjoying his terror. He tasted blood, metallic and coppery, and realized he had been cut on his cheek. Desperation clawed at him, threatening to consume him. He had to fight back, he had to survive, but the attackers were relentless, their movements swift and brutal. He was outmatched, outmaneuvered, and he knew it. Section 5. A desperate plea. Jacob fell back against a tree, his back scraping against rough bark. He was trapped, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his body screaming in protest. He saw Max lying motionless on the ground a few feet away, and a sob escaped his lips. They had hurt Max. Rage, primal and consuming, surged through him, momentarily eclipsing his fear. He would make them pay. He would. But even as the thought formed in his mind, he knew it was futile. He was no match for them. He was going to die here, alone, in the darkness. The figure with the knife advanced, their features still hidden in the shadows of their hood. Jacob closed his eyes, bracing himself for the final blow. But the blow didn't come. He opened his eyes cautiously and saw the figure staring down at him, their head cocked to one side as if listening to something. He heard it then, too. A faint ringing sound like a distant siren. The figure with the knife hesitated, their gaze flicking from Jacob to the source of the sound. Hope, fragile and desperate, flickered in Jacob's chest. Someone was coming. He could hear the siren growing louder, closer. The figures exchanged a look, something passing between them that Jacob couldn't decipher. Then, with a finality that chilled him to the bone, they melted back into the shadows, disappearing as quickly and silently as they had arrived. Jacob lay there, his chest heaving, his body trembling with the aftershocks of terror and adrenaline. He could hear the siren now, much closer, the sound growing in volume with each passing second. He fumbled for his phone, his fingers closing around the familiar shape. Relief washed over him, so profound it almost hurt. He was safe. He was going to be okay. He lifted the phone to his ear, his thumb hovering over the call button. Section 6 vanished. 911, what is your emergency? The voice on the other end of the line was calm, professional, a lifeline to sanity in a world that had suddenly tilted on its axis. "Help!" Jacob croaked, his voice hoarse and trembling. "I've been attacked! Willow Park! I need—" He never got to finish the sentence. A sharp pain exploded in his head, and then everything went black. The first responders found Jacob's body slumped against the base of an ancient oak tree, the phone still clutched in his lifeless hand. His face was pale, his eyes staring vacantly into the darkness. There was a single stab wound to his chest, a fatal blow that had ended his life swiftly and brutally. The park, bathed in the harsh glare of police lights, seemed to hold its breath, the silence heavy with unspoken tragedy. Detectives swarmed the scene, their movements efficient and practiced as they searched for clues, but the attackers had vanished, leaving behind no trace of their presence save for the echo of their violence. Max, to everyone's surprise, was gone. The dog, usually inseparable from his owner, had disappeared without a trace. There were whispers, rumors that spread like wildfire through the city. Some said the attackers were part of a gang, others that they were something more sinister, something not quite human. The police, however, remained skeptical. They attributed the attack to a random act of violence, a tragic but all too common occurrence in a city grappling with its share of darkness. The case, despite their best efforts, went cold. The attackers were never found, their motives never uncovered. Willow Park, once a sanctuary for peace and tranquility, became a place of whispers and fear, forever marked by the shadow of Jacob's murder. Section 7. The Phantom Leash. Weeks turned into months, and the memory of that terrible night faded into the background of the city's collective consciousness. Life, as it always does, went on, but for those who knew Jacob, the pain of his loss lingered, a dull ache that refused to be soothed. Willow Park remained eerily quiet, the laughter of children replaced by an unsettling stillness. The trees seemed to whisper secrets to the wind, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers, forever grasping for something they could never reclaim. And then the stories began. At first they were dismissed as the ramblings of grief-stricken mourners desperate to find meaning in senseless tragedy. But the stories persisted, becoming more frequent, more detailed, too consistent to ignore. People reported seeing a lone Labrador roaming the park at night, its coat as black as the shadows that clung to the trees. They said its eyes glowed with an unnatural light, a haunting luminescence that sent chills down the bravest of spines. Others claimed to hear the clatter of a dog's leash dragging across the pavement, the rhythmic thudding echoing through the stillness, always just out of sight. And always the stories ended the same way, with the phantom dog vanishing into thin air, leaving behind only a lingering sense of unease and the faint scent of ozone, like the air after a lightning strike. Whether these stories were true or merely figments of an overactive imagination, born out of grief and fear, remained a mystery. But one thing was certain: the memory of Jacob and his faithful companion Max continued to haunt Willow Park, a chilling reminder that even in the most ordinary of places, darkness can lurk just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to emerge.